So welcome, Ellen Lupton, to our TDC virtual salons. If you're in the design field, you almost don't need an introduction, Ellen. You are the sort of preeminent design historian we have. So Ellen, full disclosure, I worked with Ellen at, I forgot where, Design Writing Research, and she was also
and Cooper Union.
And Cooper Union, the Herb LeBallin Center. So we go way back. And obviously she's you're head of the Masters Design Department.
I'm on the faculty of the MFA program at MICA. Very proud to do that. Yeah.
And she's the senior design curator at the Cooper Hewitt. Mm-hmm. So welcome, Ellen Lupton.
Thank you. I'm going to just jump right into it so we can stay on time. You should be able to see my screen, right?
Yes.
Good, good, good. So I'm happy to represent Cooper Hewitt Museum today. We have a beautiful show on view at Cooper Hewitt, only the lights are off and the door is closed for obvious reasons of public safety. So I'm just so happy to be able to share this material that I'm super obsessed with, nerdy, in love with the Bauhaus and everything that touches on it. And so I wish I could bring you there in person, but this is really good too, because I see there's people from Argentina and all over who maybe weren't going to make it to New York this summer. So that's what the show looks like. It's really fun and engaging. And many of the pieces are borrowed from our dear friend, Merrill Berman, who is the world's preeminent collector of graphic design. And many of the pieces are from our own collection at Cooper Hewitt. In 2016, we acquired over 500 pieces of work by Herbert Bayer. And this exhibition was a chance to tell the whole story of his career and to share some of these pieces for the first time, which just haven't been exhibited and aren't well known. And we're doing a book that's coming out this fall. So there's lots of ways that we're sharing Herbert Bayer with the world and telling the story of this super interesting designer. And the book has stuff from Merrill Berman, from Display Graphic Design Collection, the Bauhaus Archive, Letterform Archive, and more. So there's so much to see. So we're going to start in Weimar, which is where the Bauhaus was founded in 1919. And it's right there in that lower part of the middle part of the country. And Herbert Bayer became a student in 1921 at the Bauhaus. And in a way, he was the perfect Bauhaus student because he really didn't know anything. And part of the philosophy of the Bauhaus was basically to erase everything, your preconceptions, your historical cliches, your prior belief system, and start from nothing. This was kindergarten for art. So Herbert Bayer was perfect for that because he really didn't know anything. He walked from the town of Darmstadt to Weimar. And I think it's really interesting as we look at these people and the history of the Bauhaus to just have a sense of the kind of hardship that people experienced. Most of these students were very poor. The school had very little money. People were often hungry and cold. It was not an easy life. And so I think that is sort of interesting to think of at this moment when we all are looking at new kinds of hardship and challenges. Of course, Walter Gropius was the director of the Bauhaus. He was an architect and a very strong leader of the school and someone who developed quite a feeling of mentorship for Herbert Bayer early on. Beyer initially worked and studied in the wall painting workshop of Kandinsky. He had already read Kandinsky's book, The Spiritual in Art. And so this was one of the only things he knew about art. And he was very impressed by Kandinsky and did work very influenced by him. So Kandinsky was famous for this equation of the circle, square, triangle, yellow, red, blue, which became an icon for Bauhaus philosophy in 1923, this kind of almost a logo for the theory of the Bauhaus. And Beyer was loving that and created this stairwell design that interprets that yellow triangle, red square, blue circle in space, right? And this is in the wall painting workshop at the Bauhaus. And many of his pieces in these early years are really about geometry. And I love this postcard, which in essence is a geometry lesson. It's like from a textbook of how to draw a circle, square, and triangle. But he turns all those lines of construction into design elements, into the storytelling of the piece. And it's kind of a wonderful expression of Bauhaus pedagogy at this moment in time. This postcard was from Berman's collection, and this is extremely rare because it's hand painted. So this is a design for a postcard, and it's really fun to come in close and experience how he had to paint all the lettering by hand and the little guidelines for his lettering, and to really experience this as a handmade piece. In those early years at the Bauhaus, there was a print shop, but it was for artistic printing. It was not for commercial printing. So postcards like that were all printed lithographically in the shop. So the elders, right, there's a generation of faculty at the Bauhaus, including Kandinsky and Gropius, who are really these eminent figures. In the early 20s, Kandinsky was already world famous as an abstract painter. It was this, very dignified, intense, elder person. There was also turmoil. So Johannes Itten, who was the first teacher of the basic course, did not get on well with Gropius, and there was much conflict and trouble. And eventually Itten was forced to resign. And he was replaced by the new guy, Moholy-Nagy, who arrived in 1923 and was able to implement what Gropius really wanted, which was this marriage of art and technology. And Moholy-Nagy was young. He was often confused for a student. He brought incredible energy and kind of wild enthusiasm to his teaching. He experienced hardship too. So on his way from Hungary to Berlin in the winter of 1920, he contracted the Spanish flu and nearly died. When he arrived in Berlin, he was rescued by a teacher who kind of found him and took care of him and enabled him to survive. And Beyer and Moholy-Nagy, so they're about 5 years apart in age. And Moholy-Nagy is by far the visionary, wild thinker, big idea person, and who comes to the Bauhaus with constructivism in his briefcase. He brings this avant-garde theory to the school. And Beyer is more of still learning, right? He's new. And in 1923, they produced this book together, and Beyer did the cover, and Moholy-Nagy did the inside of the book. And it's fun to look at the cover and see the sort of artifactuality of the printing process, this, letterpress edges of the ink, and that black paper coming through it, beautifully reconstructed in this facsimile from Lars Mueller that just came out. So I love seeing that materiality of the work. And then we go inside the book, which Moholy-Nagy designed. And when we say he designed it, I want you to experience what that meant. This was not taking a folder of JPEGs and an existing manuscript and laying it out. Moholy-Nagy, with Gropius, determined what this book would be. He determined how the content would exist, what its argument would be. And he would go on to do that for the 14 volumes of Bauhaus books. So for Moholy-Nagy, jumping into this, really not knowing anything about graphic design or typography, but just knowing, you know, we've got to print this book, and this book is a manifesto of what the Bauhaus is in 1923 at this moment. And if we look at the typography, you might go like, meh, you know, it's not that good, right? It's a square book, you know, which is hard, you know, square books are hard to design. And he kind of did the big dumb thing, which is just make the type as wide as possible in the square. And it's clunky, you know. But I look at this and it just fills me with joy, the ambition and the fearlessness to simply say, hey, we are the Bauhaus, and we're going to have to print books, and our books are going to be modern. They're going to be new, and we're going to figure it out as we go. And he was just like that, just fearless. And in that book, he published this essay called The New Typography. And a young man named Jan Chickhold bought this book and carried it away with him and thought about it for another 5 years before making his book, okay? And so the new typography is born at the Bauhaus in this fantastic one-page square essay by Moholy-Nagy. And it has the principles, it has the ideas of it's functional, the use of photography, the belief that film will ultimately replace the book altogether. It's full of these visionary ideas. And as is the case with many manifestos, it kind of left the details to be worked out in practice, right? That they would all now get busy making the new typography, right? Figuring out what it should look like. Herbert Bayer, as a student, created some of his most innovative work as a student, including these speculative designs for commercial kiosks that he produced without any classroom or workshop setting. He did these on his own, and Gropius was like, knew that graphic design was going to be important. And he encouraged Beyer to try this stuff, which is really cool, which kind of laid the ground for Bayer's exhibition design that he would do starting in 1930, which we won't really get into much today, but is a super interesting part of his work. So this kiosk, which is, you know, multi-stories high, note how he spaces out these rings as it gets to the bottom to compensate for optical effects, you know, like the Trajan column, which is sort of cool. Right, and it's fun to see him creating this typography for electricity, not quite knowing how it would be executed, but, you know, putting it together. And his exhibition design work would build on those visionary ideas later. So Dessau, the Bauhaus moves to Dessau in 1925, brand new modernist campus designed by Walter Gropius, and signage by the young Herbert Bayer. And Beyer returns to the Bauhaus. This is his diagram of Dessau, which is the center of the universe. Really cool infographic. Beyer returns to the Bauhaus as a young master. So he is now a teacher at the Bauhaus, and he's given the task of setting up a modern letterpress print shop so that the Bauhaus can create practical graphic design work, which they need for their survival. It's not just they think students ought to know this, but the school realizes it needs graphic design to sell itself, right? To sell its products and its lectures and its books and its philosophy. I love this photograph of the Bauhaus Masters standing on the roof of the Dessau building in 1926. This is all the faculty members, one woman, Gunther Stoetzel. And if we come in close, we see this triumvirate of the graphic design guys. And it's very interesting to me how they're situated in space, because Moholy-Nagy is like by far the leader and the visionary, the the brains of the operation, in short. And Herbert Bayer was very much a professional. He didn't really like teaching. He liked just working in the shop, and the students would work with him. But he really liked doing the stuff. He liked designing, you know. And Ise Schmidt was an incredible designer who's not as well known, and we could do a whole thing on Ise Schmidt. And he also loved to teach, and he really created theoretical exercises at the Bauhaus that are similar to what is taught today. And that story isn't really known enough, and it's interesting to me that he's in the back, a little bit overwhelmed by the other two really famous guys. And this is some of the stuff that Herbert Bayer printed and designed at the Bauhaus. He made these amazing letterheads that divide space in this functional way. And each of the letterheads has at the bottom of it a manifesto about printing in all lowercase letters, which is this idea about egalitarian typography and erasing the kingly capital in favor of the sort of social democratic ideal of lowercase. It's kind of beautiful. And Beyer held on to that for his whole life, long after everybody else realized it was a really dumb idea. And he did these incredible catalogs that translated the product design aesthetic of the Bauhaus into typography that could be printed right there in the print shop, which is amazing. He made this experimental alphabet in 1926 that he never produced as a typeface. It was really an idea. And so many things at the Bauhaus are really about the idea. And he continued to like reproduce this and promote it and refine it across his life for decades without ever really trying to make it into a font, which is interesting. As you know, it did become a font. It was made into a typeface called Bauhaus in 1975 by Ed Bengat. And I just love thinking about these two personalities and these different moments of history. And Ed Bengat saying, you know what, I'm going to make that thing into an actual typeface, you know, and we're going to give it some capital letters because this is America. People want their capital letters. And we're going to put these little gaps in here because this shit is so heavy and clunky, you know, where the circle meets the stem, it just doesn't work. So he puts these wonderful little breathing spots into it and made the kind of bell-bottoms version of Herbert Bayer's typeface. And, you know, for many people, when they see Bauhaus, this is what they think, because this typeface, maybe it comes on your operating system. You know, it's like really entered the popular culture, even though it is a complete perversion of what Herbert Bayer intended. It's actually much better. It's a much better typeface, whatever you might think of it. In 1928, many of the sort of inner circle at the Bauhaus left the school. And that inner circle included Gropius and Moholy-Nagy and Herbert Bayer. The school was always struggling for money. The Nazis were becoming more of a problem and negative force. And Herbert Bayer just wanted to work. He was sick of teaching. He just wanted to do advertising work in Berlin. So he moved to Berlin and worked as a creative director at Dorland and at German Vogue, did a bunch of things. He was in Berlin for 10 years. And many of his friends were in Berlin too. And they partied hard. And you'll see here he's with his very dear friend Zonti Shabinsky, who's of his generation, but he's also hanging out with Walter Gropius. And Gropius would continue to be this huge force in his life, and a huge force in this sort of community of Bauhaus refugees, so to speak, in Berlin. Moholy-Nagy was also in Berlin, but they weren't really buddies. There's not much evidence that Bayer partied with Moholy-Nagy. Walter Gropius was married to a beautiful young woman named Ise. They married at the Bauhaus, and Ise was not on the faculty and was not an artist, but she was very important in running the school and then kind of running the publicity machine of the Bauhaus and making the school, giving it the kind of mythic status that it had. And in the early 30s, Herbert and Ise had an intense love affair. They went skiing trips together and spent wild, passionate weekends together, and were truly in love with each other. And here you can see Ise and Zanti and Herbert, who were part of this circle of people just really enjoying being with each other. And this is a very unusual photo montage that Herbert Bayer made as a gift for Walter Gropius on his 50th birthday. So this is a one-of-a-kind cut and paste montage, and that's Gropius surrounded by angels and naked girls from, you know, pornographic magazines. And this was a gift to his mentor, given to his mentor while he was having this wild love affair with Ise. And this is from that same series, sort of representing Gropius as this muscle man and this quite erotic, suggestive image. And Gropius is standing here on top of a mountain, looking at a city made from Froebel blocks, which were sort of a thing at the Bauhaus. And eventually, Ise and Herbert revealed their love affair to Walter, and the marriage survived. Walter and Ise remained married, and Bayer's friendship with them survived too for many, many decades of mutual benefit. At the end of Ise's life, she said that she never loved anyone as much as she loved Herbert Bayer, which is sort of beautiful. So if we take a look at the incredible work that Beyer created in the 1930s, he really developed his own style of photo montage, of course influenced by surrealism. And here we can see where he's cut and pasted black and white images and then painted on top with gouache and colored pencil and, you know, tools like that to create this kind of annotation of the body. And he's using airbrush to create these gradients of sea and sand and sky in the background. And here's a shot from an ad agency in Berlin in the 30s with a giant airbrush. This was a very commonly used tool for photo retouching, of course, just for routine silhouettes and isolating or fixing somebody's skin, but also for creative work, right? For creating this kind of new reality that Herbert Bayer wanted to create. And then many of the elements of this montage are simply drawn by hand. And so he took this kind of basic drawing of perspective drawing and really used that as a visual element in his work. And he would do that often. It became kind of a technique that he would use, these radiating lines. That particular brochure was created to accompany an exhibition that was organized by the Berlin Exhibition Office in cooperation with the Nazi government. And one of the pages of the montage includes an image of Hitler overseeing these sort of massive public works projects in Germany. Of course, that's very disturbing to think about how those works were executed. And Beyer would later tear those pages out. You know, he was not proud of having included that. So Cooper Hewitt's copy of this booklet doesn't have this page in it, which is interesting. In that same series, Beyer created this booklet for Deutschland Ausstellung, or Germany exhibition, showing Germany at the center of the globe, 1936. And it's a celebration of German culture, past and present, you know, music, architecture, literature, and it has this image in it, which is very disturbing and reflects, obviously, Nazi ideology. It's very important to note that Herbert Bayer was not a Nazi. He was never a member of the Nazi Party. He did not believe in its racial views. He objected to its totalitarian governing methods. He had a Jewish wife. He was included in the degenerate art exhibition. So he faced a lot of problems in the 30s. But he also had a career that flourished, unlike many of his contemporaries. I'll just briefly show this piece by his friend Zanti, who moved to Italy in the early 30s and did incredible work in Italy, but also including this piece celebrating Mussolini and really using graphic design to express the theory of fascism, right? The crowd of people supported by the dictator, by the charismatic head, so to speak. So Beyer left in 1938, was glad to be able to escape Germany, went to do a big exhibition at MoMA, which gave him kind of his ticket to leave Germany. And I'll just show a few things from that period. This really weird photo montage is a ham accompanied by Allied fighter jets. It was published in 1942. And Cooper Hewitt has this in our collection, but it's just like cut out of a magazine page like this. There's no context. So we did a little research and we found that what this is advertising is cooking with a gas stove. It's a completely commercial piece, but it uses the rhetoric of wartime propaganda to sell gas. Sort of interesting. And that's his technique of these pencil lines pointing to an origin, is something he loved, and it adds to this feeling of drama. And this is a wonderful image from one of his exhibition designs where he's built that in three-dimensional space. And we can see that technique again here in this wonderful design for a pharmaceutical company that was selling hormone supplements to women for different monthly concerns. And they're at the center of this womb universe, right? All these lines take us to the origin point. It's quite wonderful. And the phases of the moon at the edges. And each of those lines is pointing to a day of the month, which is really cool. So this is what you do on quarantine. You discover these relationships. Sorry, I can't help myself. And some of my favorite pieces from Cooper Hewitt's collection include this campaign for men's ties, for a silk that was used in men's ties. And it's those same wonderful techniques. So cool, so interesting. In 1946, he moved to Aspen and continued to do advertising work, like these amazing ads for hair color, which many of us are learning to do ourselves. But he was also very involved with Aspen real estate and with architecture and helping to create the town of Aspen as a modern resort. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, TDC, for inviting Cooper Hewitt to share this content, and thanks to all the great collections who have contributed to our exhibition and to our book.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for that presentation, online presentation of the contents of the Herbert Bayer show at the Cooper Hewitt. So let's address some of the questions that we've gotten so far from our Q&A panel. we saw this earlier. How do you approach the desire to see more women represented in all these retrospectives of the Bauhaus, especially within graphic design?
Well, like I mentioned, there are some incredible books about women in the Bauhaus, including Libby Otto's book, Bauhaus Women. So there's quite a lot of information. Most of these women weren't that involved with graphic design. So somebody mentioned Annie Albers, who of course, her two-dimensional works are very influential to designers. And she was a huge force. Mariana Brandt, the product designer, did amazing photo montages in the 1920s that are, you know, graphic design adjacent. There were more Dada in their force. And one of the most important early Bauhaus typography works is is called Utopia, which was created by Johannes Itten and has some spectacular typography in it. And the typography was created by Friedel Dicker, who is a young woman and follower of Itten at that time. And it's really one of the most spectacular Bauhaus pieces. And she did the typography, which is unbelievably beautiful.
Yeah, and I think
they're there.
Along with that, there's, you know, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus, there have been a lot more books published on women at the Bauhaus, students, and so I would recommend that you guys look that up. So why Herbert Bayer now? Like, why show his work? I mean, other than commemorating.
No, it's a good question. So Herbert Bayer was the most prolific graphic designer at the Bauhaus. So he was part of the inner circle. So there were hundreds of people that passed through the Bauhaus. But he was one of the people that was like a leader at the school. You know, he was part of this group that not only was a leader at the school, but then after 1928 was part of the endless myth-making apparatus of the school through his relationship with Gropius, you know. And the other thing is that Herbert Bayer lived a long time. He lived until 1985 and was active for that entire time, whereas Moholy-Nagy died in 45 or 46, you know, very young. Youth Schmidt, same thing. So some of the other amazing people simply didn't have the time in their lives to create what Herbert Bayer did. So I think it's very interesting to just see the trajectory of his life and how creative the work was after the Bauhaus as well, especially in the 30s.
So another question talks about his sort of practice when he left Germany. So when he was an art director, did he work for himself or did he work for an agency? Who were his clients in terms of like?
He worked for an agency called Dorland, which was an international ad agency that also had an office in New York and in London. And when he came to New York, he worked with them in New York. But apparently he was quite independent in the work that he did. He was allowed to sign his name to his work. So many of the pieces in Cooper Hewitt's collection are signed by Herbert Bayer, which is fun to see. You know, that would never happen today. You know, so the notion that this modern artist was bringing elan to these clients by having his name printed and that it was considered artistic, these advertisements that he created, is quite interesting.
And then where does one start to like investigate exhibition design work by Herbert Bayer? I know you showed that one piece that was that.
Yeah, that's a whole fascinating subject. There are some good articles about it. And if anybody wants to email me, I'd be happy to point you to good things to read about it. There's a wonderful book that just came out about the director of the RISD Museum, Walter. Anyway, he did some innovative things with Beyer. And there's some just good books on the history of exhibition design, which must include him because he really was so fundamental. In the book that we're doing with Cooper Hewitt and Moleskine Books, we're reprinting the entire theoretical essays by Beyer that he published in 1939 in PM magazine, facsimile layouts, and that includes his extensive essay on exhibition design. So that's really nice. So you can find that online too, but ours is like going to be very special. And thank you, Display Graphics, for helping us with that imagery.
Another question is, do you think anything like the Bauhaus exists today or something close to it?
Sure. I think that Eindhoven Academy and ECAL, you know, these schools that are experimenting and trying to look at design in this expansive, critical, open-ended way. You know, Moholy-Nagy, when he was at the new Bauhaus in Chicago, he said that the project is not design, the project is man. Which is really cool, like that he felt that what they were doing was creating a framework for human life. And I think that there's a lot of interest in that now, you know, in post-human life now.
Trying to catch up with questions here.
Yeah, sure.
Can you comment on any other sort of crossover in terms of between L. Lissitzky and the Bauhaus and Beyer, other than the exhibition?
Yeah, sure. So L. Lissitzky worked and traveled in Germany in the early 1920s. So unlike the other Russian constructivists who by and large stayed in Russia, L. Lissitzky had a huge impact on Western European design because he was there. And his friends were, you know, Schwitters and Van Doesburg, and he met Pete Svart, and he knew Moholy-Nagy. So L. Lissitzky is there in the background for any avant-garde typography in the 20s. I don't know that he ever met Herbert Bayer, but Herbert Bayer cannot exist without those other people. Herbert Bayer, again, you know, he's younger and fresh on the scene and knows nothing and is this kind of open book who opens himself to avant-garde thinking and, you know, lives it.
Right. And who is responsible for bringing Herbert Bayer to the U.S.? Was it people at MoMA when you talked about the show that was involved?
Yeah, so MoMA asked Gropius to create a Bauhaus exhibition at MoMA. And tellingly, the exhibition was called Bauhaus 1919 to 1928, which was the period that Gropius was there. You know, it was this high, you know, it was not the after Gropius era. And Gropius and Moholy-Nagy asked Beyer to actually execute the exhibition. So, you know, Beyer is credited with designing the exhibition, but really he determined everything about it. He devoted himself wholeheartedly to it. And there were many, it was very hard to get the actual artifacts because of the situation in Germany. So a lot of things were reconstructed and presented in photo blow-ups. It was very modern. It reminds me of things that, you know, you would do, Paul, at the Museum of City of New York or at Cooper Hewitt, you know, where it's storytelling with graphics, not just with, you know, originals. So it was very intense and very formative for Beyer, that experience.
And how did Americans get to know the Bauhaus? You know, like, I know they were publishing materials, but then who were the people who were looking for that stuff here in the US to sort of get
Well, I think that the exhibitions and books and, you know, Gropius teaching at Harvard and the new Bauhaus momentarily in Chicago that then became, you know, other things. But it was really, or Black Mountain College. you know, that through the educational system, you know, and so many Bauhaus people who came to teach in the US, but also the prodigious, endless publishing and lectures, promotion, like these guys and women, all of them, used their experience at the Bauhaus, that resume line, for the rest of their careers. Albers, you know, Ani and Joseph, that experience at the Bauhaus was part of who they were, and they continued to talk about it, promote it, build on it. I would too.
Yeah. Question random, but any connection between Paul Rand and Herbert Bayer? Do we know if
I'm not sure. It seems like they would have known each other, you know, because Herbert Bayer was so, you know, was part of all that Aspen stuff, you know, the sort of clubby modernist design world in Aspen. So I imagine that they knew each other.
And, you know, since Beyer was still alive in the 70s, did he know about Bauhaus typeface?
I don't know, and that's on my to-do list, is to figure out what he thought of it, you know, what his impression was of that. He must have known about it. But.
So what are you working on next?
I'm working on a book about design and feminism with my dear friend and collaborator, Jennifer Tobias. It's called Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, subversive, non-binary field guide for graphic designers. And that's coming out in the spring with Princeton Architectural Press. And it's really fun, illustrated kind of zine of theory and practice related to inclusive design. And this Herbert Bayer book is coming out in the fall. And I just finished a book with my friend Bon Ku, who's an emergency room doctor in Philadelphia. And this is our book on health design thinking. And so I'm really interested in healthcare. And of course, all the stuff going on now with really inventing new approaches to healthcare during COVID. So Cooper Hewitt's going to do a show about that next year, and I'm working on that with Mass Design Group, who are the leading designers of healthcare facilities in the world.
And do you know if Chicold and back to Bauhaus. I keep getting questions.
We love the Bauhaus. We never leave the Bauhaus.
Did Chicold and Beyer have a relationship?
Yeah, so here's another book I recommend.
Perfect time.
This is Paul Sturton's amazing book on Jan Chicold and the new typography. Yes, Beyer and Chicold were friends. So Chicold visited the Bauhaus in 1923 when this huge exhibition was held where this book was published as part of that exhibition. And so Chicold went to the Bauhaus, saw that exhibition, bought this book, read Moholy-Nagy's essay called The New Typography, and was converted. You know, it was like an experience, you know, one of those come to God experiences. And then Chicold, throughout the 1920s, made friendships with many of the avant-garde designers and collected all their stuff. And that collection became the basis of his book, The New Typography in 1928, which includes some of Herbert Bayer's letterheads.
And then some other questions, back to Beyer, sorry. We'll
That's
follow
what we're
up.
here for. Yeah.
So Container Corporation of America, what was his role there? And then the great ideas of Western man?
Yes, that's a whole area. So Moholy-Nagy introduced Beyer to Walter Pepke, who is the chairman of the Container Corporation of America, which made paper boxes, which is not a very sexy product. And Herbert Bayer launched this multi-year campaign to celebrate, you know, humanistic thought with a little logo about paper boxes at the bottom. And Walter Pepke went to Aspen and bought real estate in Aspen and decided that he was going to develop Aspen as a chic resort town for the wealthy intelligentsia. And he invited the young Herbert Bayer to move to Aspen in 1946 and help him with this venture of transforming that city into something completely different. It was an old-fashioned Victorian town, and they turned it into a destination. And Herbert Bayer was very involved with that and lived there until 1975, when his health was failing, and he moved to Southern California to be in the sun with Joella, his wife, his second wife, and who he was married to for many, many years.
Do you know anything about his later years? You know, like.
Yeah, he was very involved in sculpture and earthworks and did architectural work. The Aspen story is like its own story that we didn't get into much in the Cooper Hewitt show because we don't have all that much documenting it. But that's all. He's a hero in Aspen. There's a whole museum opening dedicated to Herbert Bayer. And it's a very interesting practice that goes way beyond graphic design.
And another question, how do you get your ideas for exhibitions? What do you like, do focus groups or anything like that within the museum? You know, like internally at the Cooper Hewitt, you know, do you just throw out ideas? How do you get started?
It's very collaborative. You know, the curators get together and talk, and we look for opportunities. Like, we really wanted to do something wonderful with Merrill Berman and his fantastic collection, but we saw this also as an opportunity to show our Herbert Bayer material. And the story of Herbert Bayer really needs both parts. You know, you can't talk about Herbert Bayer and not have the Bauhaus. But his career is actually so much more than that. In a way, the Bauhaus pieces are a little bit primitive, you know, compared to what he did later. So we look for opportunity. We look for what's happening, like this healthcare show. It's obvious that this needs to be done. Right. We're experiencing a revolution in healthcare right now. So, and design is playing a big role in it. So, you know, being aware of what's going on, talking about it, and then doing it, because ideas are cheap. It's actually getting up every day and doing the work that takes the effort.
How much of the Cooper Hewitt's collection is online? So if people want to, you know.
Oh, we have a wonderful website, and it's, I don't know the percentage, but many, many thousands of works are online and free to the public to make use of. And the whole Smithsonian has launched a big effort to make all digital collections available, and Cooper Hewitt's a leader in that.
How much
one of the most visited Smithsonian online sites, so we're very proud of that.
How much of the Beyer stuff that you
I'm not sure that that's online yet, but it will be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you show that Cheekhold book again?
Yes, this is by Paul Sturton, and it is really the definitive book on Jan Cheekhold and his influence, published in 2019, and it's fascinating, beautifully written, beautifully researched, including a whole section of the back of translations of typographic manifestos into English, which are really fun, including Liszewski and Beyer and Kurt Schwitters and Walter Dexel, and lots of really great things put together in one place to really show that the new typography was the conversation going on that was way more than one person.
And will there be an exhibition for Extra Bold?
No, that's a book I'm doing independently with my friend Jenny. It's not related to Cooper Hewitt. I have special permission to do that on my own.
Great. Thank you. I think that's all the questions.
Okay, it's great. I love all your questions. This was so fun.
Yes, good to see you again.
Please visit us at cooperhewitt.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We're sharing beautiful, inspiring stuff from our collection every day. So
yes,
design lives.
Yes, national treasure. Ellen Lupton and the Cooper Hewitt.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and stay safe.
Bye-bye. This is so
much.
fun. Thank you.
Bye.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for coming. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.